Hello and welcome to Military Images Live. This is Season 2, Episode 4, coming to you from Military Images headquarters in Arlington, Virginia. My name is Ron Coddington. I'm the editor and publisher of Military Images magazine. We've been around since 1979. A magazine that's dedicated to Civil War portrait photography and supporting all of the collecting community. I see we have some folks coming on. David Yunt is here. Hey, David. Elizabeth Topping is here. How you doing, Liz? Michael Pissarro is here. I see some heads up coming in from Kevin Drake. Anne is here. Gene, thank you. These are the same specs. I did clean the lenses, so thank you for noticing. Hey, Liz, how are you doing this evening? It's great to see you virtually on the program. I want to talk a little bit about tonight as we're waiting for folks to get on about something that Doug York of Civil War Faces and I began talking about months and months and months ago, which is our very first ever Civil War Faces photo show and sale. As you'll see by the card that's next to me, if you've been to any of the Civil War shows in recent months, you've probably seen these cards laying on tables and other places at the shows. And hard to believe that it's coming up in just a couple weeks. We have a whole weekend planned in the Washington, D.C. area, specifically in Arlington, which is just across the Potomac River. We have an amazing weekend of activities. We have a special behind-the-scenes visit planned at the Library of Congress on Friday, March 8th, followed by dinner at the Old Ebbitt Grill. Saturday evening, the next day, we will have a series of talks. It's called Civil War Photo Talks. We'll have Kurt Luther from Civil War Photo Sleuth. We'll have Micah Messenheimer from the Library of Congress. We'll have Ann Schumard from the National Portrait Gallery. We'll have Rick Brown, one of our senior editors at Military Images magazine. We'll have Brian Cheeseborough of the National Archives. So we'll be having a star-studded cast to talk about Civil War photography. I hope you can join us. Of course, on Sunday is the event, the show and sale. We'll have a dozen dealers in the show area, and then of course other rooms with other dealers as well, specializing in all kinds of early photography. So you'll be noticing lots of posts coming up on Facebook as we count down the days to this big event. So I hope you can join us. And thanks again to all of you who are joining us now. So with that note, a special thanks to Doug York and all the fine folks at Civil War Faces for organizing this event and for reaching out to the community of collectors. So you may wonder what I've been up to since we talked last. One of the, and probably the best starting point I can think of is right here. We're closing the spring issue of Military Images magazine. And these last 2 weeks have been filled with last-minute writing, last-minute edits, all the design, the layout, the production. And right now, in fact, the magazine is being proofed by 6 volunteers who have eagle eyes and who are looking for any I's that weren't dotted or T's that weren't crossed while we're in production. One of the last pieces that we're working on is a feature called Stragglers, and that typically appears towards the end. Up, I see we're getting some emojis for Stragglers, so that's awesome. Stragglers is images that, pretty much single images that have been sent in by our subscribers to the magazine. And one of the images I had planned to include is this one here that was identified on this show a couple of weeks ago. And those of you who remember the story know that this is Frank Patton Gracie of the 1st Kentucky Light Artillery from the Confederate States. And Gracie was identified by Matt Higgins and Joe McGee. So I want to give a special shout out to them for helping to identify this soldier. If you recall the story, his name was inside of a case. And I was having a really difficult time trying to decipher it, but those guys came through and were able to identify him. Now, as I mentioned, I was planning to include him in the stragglers section of the magazine. And then I started learning about his story, his joining the 1st Kentucky Light Artillery and all the battles that he participated in. One of those battles, I believe it might have even been one of his first battles, was Shiloh in April of 1862. And I found a diary that sort of an oral history he had dictated to one of his, I believe it was one of his sons. And in that diary entry, he talks about the battle, and he talks about how his battery rolled into position to go up against the Union Army, and how he got off his horse to help get all the guns set up and to aim the guns at the Federal soldiers that were moving in their direction. Now, after Frank got off of his horse, who was also named Frank, and this is one of the better parts of his diary, his horse named Frank basically trotted out of the way and found a huge bale of hay that was pretty much in a safe position behind the lines. Now, while Frank, the artillery lieutenant, was out working his guns, Frank, the horse, was having a fine banquet of hay. So that story about Shiloh is something that made me move him from the straggler section to a special Shiloh gallery that we have, which features approximately 30 images of folks who have stories to tell about Shiloh. Of course, some of those who are wounded are in there, and others that have interesting stories, like Frank and Frank's horse named Frank. So what I want to talk about around Shiloh is Frank's story and the other stories that I began to research, the stories of death, of suffering. And many of you know these places: the Hornet's Nest, the Bloody Pond, the high number of casualties for what on the surface seems to be a relatively simple battle. The Confederate Army comes in early in the morning, mostly surprises the Union Army, which is commanded by General Grant, drives them all the way back to Pittsburgh Landing on a Tennessee River. Reinforcements come overnight, and then, of course, the next day, Grant's army attacks back and pretty much wins the day. So what I began to do is I started looking in newspapers from the time period to get a sense of what civilians on both sides were going through. And what I found were these accounts of shock, of dismay, of horror with the casualty counts that they were hearing about. These were astronomical casualties. And what I started to find were lots of writings, including a lot of poetry. And I want to give you just a sense of one of these poems. This appeared in the St. Paul Press. And this is just a few weeks after the battle, when you have individuals who are beginning to express themselves to talk about the horrors of the war through their husbands, their sons, their loved ones. And Clarence writes a fairly long poem, and I'm going to read you maybe just the first couple of verses to give you a sense of what he has to say. His poem is titled "The Battle at Pittsburgh Landing," and it contains a reference to the subsequent siege of Corinth, which was a Union victory after the Battle of Shiloh. Now, Butler says, and here's the beginning of his poem. He says, "A roar as through a million hells were howling out their shame. Broad leagues of heaven affrighting yells, square miles of screaming flame, a horrid purpling of the graves, a quenching of the sun, red swaths of limbs in writhing mass, and thus was Corinth won. 10,000 mothers hold their breath on tiptoe of dismay. White streams of agony and death go up to God today. 10,000 homes are black with woe. 10,000 hearts will break. Ah, Christ, what have we yet to show for all this weary ache? Pretty powerful stuff. Later critics wouldn't be so kind to Clarence Butler, but this poem, I think, regardless of what you think of its merits as a poem, certainly speaks to the shock and the horror that individuals felt in the weeks following the battle. That first line, "a million hells of screaming flame," became the title of this gallery of Shiloh casualties. And this will be part of our next issue that's coming out. To better understand Shiloh and to better understand the soldier experience through these photos, I turn to someone that you all know, Shelby Foote. In his book, The Civil War, A Narrative, he likened Shiloh to Waterloo when he says, quote, "Yet Waterloo had settled something, while this one, Shiloh, apparently had settled nothing. When it was over, the two armies were back where they started with other Waterloos ahead." In the very next sentence, Foote continues. He says, and this is where it becomes important for those of us who collect the photographs of these soldiers and tell their stories. Foote says, "In another sense, however, it had settled a great deal. The American volunteer, whatever side he was on in this war, and however green, would fight as fiercely and stand as firmly as the vaunted veterans of Europe." Pretty powerful stuff. The catastrophic death toll really captured my attention. And here's another way to look at that death toll to get a sense of it. We have up here, I've highlighted Shiloh with its total casualties of 23,746. Remember, this happens in the spring of 1862. The biggest battle fought before that, First Bull Run, had a total of 4,878 casualties. So we go from around 5,000 casualties to roughly 24,000 casualties. The enormity of that loss is pretty much beyond comprehension. So when you see poems like the one that Clarence Butler wrote, and you listen or read the words of Shelby Foote, you can get a better sense of, if you're in the moment, remember this is before the big battles, think about 4 or 5 times the number of casualties that anyone has ever seen. In fact, if I remember correctly, the total casualties at Shiloh is greater than every war before that time, the Mexican War, the Revolutionary War combined. So it's a huge number. And if you follow this list of battles all in black, you have to go all the way through 1862 to get to Stones River. Stones River is the first time that you get a battle that has more casualties in Shiloh. Even Antietam, which is over here, even Antietam doesn't equal Shiloh. So you have Stones River coming up on the last day of December of 1862 and the first day of January 1863. So you've got that. And then, of course, after that, you get massive battles. You have Chancellorsburg, you have Gettysburg, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse. All those battles are coming in 63 and 64. But here, all the way up top is Shiloh, 5 times the number of casualties of battle before that. So when you think about these men and think about how they went into battle, I think it is even more shocking when you put the casualty figures in context of the war and all the battles. It certainly helps you to understand Shelby Foote's comment about there were more Waterloos to come. There certainly were, and huge numbers of casualty. So you're going to meet about 30 of these men who became casualties or found themselves in very difficult straits and circumstances during the Battle of Shiloh in the next issue. So, moving on. I want to share this image with you. This is a story that I'm trying to understand a little bit more about. This is Edward P. Quinn. He's a lieutenant, and he served in the 123rd New York Infantry. That's one shy of the 124th New York Infantry, one of the better known New York regiments, the Orange Blossoms. The 123rd, one shy of that number. The 123rd fought equally hard. They're at Chancellorsville, where they got battered. There at Gettysburg. They went down south and fought in the operations leading up to the Atlanta campaign, suffered a number of wounded along the way. So Quinn pops up in a story, the regimental history of the 123rd at the Battle of Kolb's Farm on June 22nd, 1864. And I should tell you, the reason I became interested in this photograph is because I would like to do a gallery of soldiers that were involved in the Atlanta campaign and all the actions in North Georgia leading up to the campaign. So a bit of a call to action to all of you. If you have images from guys who have stories to tell about that campaign, I would love to know for a future gallery. So Quinn is at Kolb's Farm, where the entire 123rd New York Infantry is being used as a skirmish, as part of a skirmish line. And they come up against some really difficult Confederate fire. And the lines start to get a little bit unruly, and Quinn steps out to try and bring the situation under control. And according to the regimental history, in his anxiety, this is a quote, in his anxiety to straighten out the line, he took a gun in his hands and made an advancement, calling on his company to follow him. He advanced but a few steps when he was hit in the face with a bullet, which broke his lower jaw, and he fell to the ground. In this position, he lay some time. Meanwhile, as he's laying in no man's land, the rest of his regiment is behind him. And this is where it gets interesting. The story continues. Several times he was heard to call. Now remember, he has a shattered jaw. He was heard to call, Company C, come and take me in. Company C, come and take me in. Now, Company C, who was behind him, and keep in mind, it was not his company. He belonged to Company D. The men of Company C yelled back, Lieutenant Quinn, go to hell. Lieutenant Quinn, go to hell. That's kind of shocking to read in a Civil War narrative where usually you read stories of esprit de corps. It continues. After a while, he came in without any assistance, the rebels seeming not to fire at him. So here the Confederate soldiers, perhaps out of respect for what he tried to do, are not firing. The men of his own regiment, meanwhile, are not really helping. So after a while, he came in without any assistance, the rebels seeming not to fire at him. The story continues. It would have been as much a man's life was worth to have gone to his assistance. And probably this is what Company C thought. So there's probably a backstory here. Did he have bad blood with Company C? Did Company C like him, but they were so nervous and so scared that the best they could do is leave him to his fate? More work needs to be done to find out the full story. So we'll be looking more into Lieutenant Quinn as time goes by. And just so you know, he survived. He got a pension in 1865, and he lived until 1908. Oh. Next up is this image. It was sent in by Jim Burke. And Jim is asking, what exactly is this pin? You can see it right here, that the soldier, he's an identified infantryman, that he's wearing on his uniform. It's sort of above his breast area there. Jim is asking, what exactly is this? So I have to tell you, I was a little unsure. So I did a little research. I talked to some of our editors to get a sense of what they thought. And the general consensus was he's wearing a Scottish cloak clasp of a Celtic design, and a little bit of thinking that maybe his name or some family name was inscribed on it, sort of suggesting that he might have Scottish or Irish heritage. So that was about as far as we could take it. By the time I got back to Jim, he had actually come up with a better answer. He came up with an example of the pin itself. And this is called a blanket pin. Or I should say it has different names. It is called a cloak clasp, a penannular pin, a shawl pin, and a blanket pin. They were around for centuries, and they were used for holding clothing to your shoulder, much like you would in the Scottish tradition. The thinking here is that this gentleman used his pin to hold together a blanket or a bedroll that was around his uniform, around his shoulder. And so to get his photograph taken, he probably removed his knapsack, his bedroll, laid it on the side, picked up his musket, left the pin on, had his photograph made. And then when he was done, he went back, got his bedroll, slapped it back on his shoulder, and then went about his way. So big thanks to Jim Burke. I went back to our senior editors and talked about this with them. And to our knowledge, this is a one of a kind. We have never seen an image like this before. If you have, and you have it, or you have a photograph of it, send it my way. I'm curious to find out a little bit more of how prevalent this type of pin was, and if it was always worn on the shoulder, perhaps it was worn somewhere else. It's always interesting in context to find out how soldiers improvised, because there were no hard and fast rules about how to carry your equipment. So I can imagine that something like a blanket pin, maybe something that was worn by an uncle, a father, a grandfather, a great-grandfather, that was handed down through the family. Could have even been some sort of a good luck charm. So there you have it. Again, thanks to Jim for turning us on to that one. Next up, I get a fair amount of requests for help in finding images. And this one comes from Sherry Arnold. And this is her ancestor, Jefferson Michie, M-I-C-H-I-E, also pronounced or also spelled Mickey, as in Mickey Mouse, M-I-C-K-E-Y. And Jefferson, according to the story, he was born in Louisa County, Virginia, and was a slave owned by James Augustus Michie, who was the son of Captain James Michie, who was the grandson of the infamous Scotch John Michie, who was a notable figure in Virginia during colonial times. So as the story goes, after the Battle of Trevilian Station in Virginia, sometime around July of 1864, Jefferson fled wherever he was at the time. We assume that he was on the family plantation. He fled, And the quote is, "He ran away with Sheridan's cavalry." He didn't stay for too long because he eventually joined the 29th U.S. Colored Infantry, Company A of that regiment, enlisting in September of 1864. 34 years old, 5'2" tall. He has a pension file. This image dates from 1908, a year before Jefferson Mitchie passed away. So what Sherry is looking for, and what I hope you can help us find, is, you guessed it, a wartime image of Jefferson. So if you got any leads, any information, I'll be posting this information here on this page after the show, and you can help us try to find him. The family would truly appreciate it. Now, I have another request that have come in, and this comes from David Lane, who describes himself, he lives in Indiana. He describes himself as a Confederate in Yankee land. And longtime subscriber, he says, first-time contact, meant to write sooner. He says, "I have a question you might be able to help me with, if anyone can. One of my favorite Confederate memoirs / histories is The History of a Brigade of South Carolinians, McGowan's Brigade, by J.F.J. Caldwell. Here's the question. Is there a wartime image that exists of J.F.J. Caldwell? He's tried and failed to find it." So, David, I tried to, did not have a lot of luck. So we're going to reach out to all of you to see if you can help. Here's an early copy of the book that Caldwell wrote. Caldwell is one of these guys where, like many authors of Civil War regimental histories, we don't really think too much about who they are, what they did. We assume that they were knowledgeable folks, but we really don't always know their backstory. We're usually more interested in the folks that they're writing about rather than the authors themselves. Well, Caldwell is one of those guys that's definitely probably worth knowing. He was a lawyer in South Carolina, and when the war started, he enlisted as a private in the 1st South Carolina Infantry, which is an interesting move for an educated man, an attorney, to sign up as a private. Anyway, he didn't remain a private long. He soon came under the notice of the regiment's colonel, Daniel Hamilton, who figured, hey, this guy is on the ball. I need an aide and a secretary. And so Caldwell fit the bill. And Caldwell serves in this capacity on the staff of Colonel Hamilton until after the Battle of Fredericksburg. At that point, this man, Samuel McGowan, becomes head of, McGowan's brigade. And McGowan somehow finds out about Caldwell and who he is and what his potential is. And McGowan makes Caldwell his ordnance officer. And Caldwell has this to say, quote, General McGowan had selected, the author of a foreword says, General McGowan had selected him as the brigade historian. And Mr. Caldwell had always thought that McGowan's object on transferring him to the ordnance department was that no harm might come to him and that he might be spared to write a history of the brigade. This he did, completing it after the war and publishing it in 1866. So here we have Caldwell. The war is just over. It's 1866, and he's publishing a brigade history. I happen to agree with David Lane. I used the book when I produced my book on Confederate soldiers a few years ago, and found the brigade history one of the more engaging and well-written. So now it's up to you to try to help us. We're looking for a picture of James Fitzjames Caldwell from the war. We have, there may be an image of him after the war, but we're looking for a wartime image. So dig into what you have see what you can find. Got one more for you this evening. Thank you for all the emojis. Raise your hand if you know this Union officer. Let me see. Give me an emoji if you know this Union officer. I'm not seeing any right now. Well, here's the same guy over here as a young man in the 1840s, and over here with a hairstyle similar to mine and an awfully impressive beard. So what we want to know here is this guy, the reason he's not particularly known is because he's behind the scenes. He's a staffer, and his name is William Augustus Nichols. He actually, towards the end of his career, he's chief of staff to William Tecumseh Sherman and Phil Sheridan. This is in the couple of years after the Civil War. So this is a highly polished officer. The reason I found out about him, and I have to admit, I did not know who he was prior to a couple of weeks ago. We're working on a story about Mexican War portraits. And these are really important to our history because these are pictures, the earliest photographs of military men in uniform. And one of the images that we've identified that you'll see in the gallery is Nichols. And here he is as a young man, as a lieutenant, soon after the Battle of Molino del Rey in 1847, which is around the time period of the fall of Mexico City. And at this time, he's reporting to Colonel John Garland and Garland's brigade. And in the battle, Nichols proves himself to be a fantastic staffer, like the ultimate staff officer. And he gets a brevet as a young guy. He's been out of West Point for a few years, actually since 1838. And so here's this guy making a name for himself early in his career, not necessarily as a frontline leader. Other guys were doing that. But here's Nichols behind the scene, making sure that the traffic is running, making sure orders are delivered, taking initiative to make sure that that orders are obeyed and carried out. So these are the eyes, these aides, guys like Nichols, are the eyes and ears, making the connections between the desires of their commanders and the troops on the ground. So it's perhaps no surprise that Nichols stays in the Army after the war with Mexico, and he's in a staff position. In 1861, he finds himself in the Department of Texas, and he negotiates the surrender of Union forces down in Texas. And part of the surrender means he surrendered himself. So he becomes a prisoner of war. He eventually is released, exchanged, basically rejoins the Army, spends almost the rest of the war in Washington, D.C., working as a staffer, helping to manage the large armies. It's only after the war that he becomes a staffer to Sherman and then to Sheridan. This photo of him is taken when he's 45 years old on his 45th birthday in 1863. So when the war is over, he serves Sherman, and then he's appointed to serve as Sheridan's chief of staff, and he dies just a few months afterwards. Still relatively young man. He's 50 years old, but he passes from the scene. What he might have done for Sherman and Sheridan beyond the 1860s, we'll never know because he dies in 1869. So more to come on that when we do our Mexican War gallery, which will probably be in our summer issue. So with that, I'm going to leave all of you for the evening. Again, I want to mention our Civil War Faces show and sale coming up on March 8th to 10th. We'll do some postings here so you can get more information about that. On behalf of Doug York, I hope that if you live in the area or want to come into DC, come see Doug, come see we'll get together. Let us know if you're interested in the Library of Congress tour. We've already filled one group. We're building a second group right now. So we'd love to have you. We'd love to meet you. and stay for the Library of Congress, stay for the show on Saturday night, and then, of course, the sales event on Sunday. And by the way, if you can't make it, Doug is going to be having a Civil War show and sale on his Facebook page, so you can participate in the sale if you can't make it. If you also can't make it, on Saturday night, the Civil War photo talks are going to be live streamed on Facebook. So you'll be able to tune in and catch all of our speakers. So I hope you can join us, whether you're here in Washington or if you join us on Facebook. We'd love to see you. And with that, I wish you happy hunting to all of my friends in the Civil War photo collecting community. And we will see you next time on Military Images Live. Take care. Have a great night.